My daughter and her husband cleared out $195,000 from the investment account my late wife and I had spent 31 years building together. 2 weeks later, my son-in-law was cutting the ribbon on a brand new craft brewery with his name above the door, wearing a smile I'd seen him rehearse 1,000 times at family dinners. 3 months after that, his phone rang on a Tuesday morning, and I heard him screaming at the wall of his empty bar because every account he owned had been frozen. I want to tell you exactly how that happened. My wife Carol passed in March, 2 years before any of this. Pancreatic cancer, 9 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was 61 years old, and she made the best peach cobbler in Williamson County, and she never raised her voice at anyone in her life, not once that I ever witnessed. 34 years of marriage, and I still caught myself turning to say something to her when the news came on at night. The grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the room with you. Our daughter Ashley was 33 at the time of the theft. She and her husband Connor had been married 6 years, living in a rental house about 20 minutes from me in Franklin, Tennessee. Connor was the kind of man who talked about his potential more than he worked toward it. He had what I'd call a rotating portfolio of big ideas. A food truck he sold at a loss, a sports memorabilia business that never moved past a website, a real estate license he obtained and never used. My daughter was a middle school art teacher and patient with him in a way that sometimes made me wince. I spent 26 years as a fraud investigator for a regional insurance company before retiring at 62. I know how to read a paper trail. I know what financial behavior looks like when someone is hiding something and what it looks like when someone simply doesn't know what they're doing. Connor was many things, but he was not sophisticated. I knew that, which is part of why I never saw it coming from that direction. The investment account held $195,000. Carol and I had built it together during the lean years and the good years both, contributing whatever we could manage, watching it grow across 3 decades, the way you watch a tree you planted grow in your backyard. We had listed Ashley as a joint beneficiary with transfer on death rights, meaning the funds would pass to her outside of probate when I died. Standard planning for a parent who wants to spare their child the courts. What I had not done, and what I deeply regret, was update the signatory access after Carol passed. For a brief administrative window, while the account was being restructured through the estate, Ashley had been granted limited power of attorney to manage affairs on my behalf. I was not well in those weeks. The grief had taken something out of me physically, the way it sometimes does, and my physician had me on medication that made the world feel gauzy. Ashley handled paperwork. I trusted her. The limited POA had technically expired, but the brokerage, through a clerical failure I will not detail beyond saying it cost them significantly in a subsequent civil action, had not properly closed her access. Connor found out. I don't know exactly how the conversation went between them, but I know from what came later that it was Connor's idea and Ashley's silence that made it possible. I discovered it on a Thursday morning in April. I had scheduled a consultation with an orthopedic surgeon about my left hip, which had needed replacing for 2 years, and I was finally ready to move forward. I logged into the brokerage account to verify the funds were available and intact before scheduling the preoperative appointment. The balance was $4,311. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, long enough that my coffee went cold. I kept refreshing the screen the way you do when a number doesn't make sense, as if the page might correct itself. The transaction history showed a series of withdrawals across an 11-day period in late March, each one structured just below the $10,000 reporting threshold. Classic structuring. I recognized it immediately from my professional years. Someone had done a little homework or gotten lucky guessing at what would attract attention. I called the brokerage and spent 90 minutes on hold, and then with 2 different representatives who were apologetic in the specific corporate way that means they are terrified of liability. They confirmed the withdrawals had been authorized under the power of attorney documentation they had on file. I didn't yell. I told them I would be following up in writing, and that they should preserve all records associated with the account. Then I drove to Ashley's house. Connor's pickup truck sat in the driveway, brand new. A red Ford F-250 with chrome trim still gleaming. I recognized it as a truck he had mentioned wanting for 2 years, the specific model and color. One of those passing comments men make about things they can't afford. I parked on the street and sat there for a moment looking at that truck. Ashley answered the door. She looked at my face and something shifted in her expression, something I had never seen on my daughter's face before and haven't been able to fully name since. Not guilt exactly, more like the face of someone who had been waiting for a knock on a door and had spent a long time hoping it would never come. I asked her what had happened to the account. She told me she didn't know what I was talking about. She said it with the slightly elevated pitch and the sideways glance toward the hallway that told me Connor was somewhere nearby, probably listening. I told her the account held $4,311. I told her I needed my hip replaced. I told her I wanted to know where the money had gone. She started crying, which was real crying, not performed. And she said everything would be okay and that she loved me and that maybe I should talk to Connor, and then she went to get him, and I stood in my own daughter's doorway and felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. Connor came out with his hands in his jeans pockets and his chin slightly elevated, which was a posture I had seen him use when he was preparing to hold a position. He said he could explain. He said the money was a loan, not a theft, that he had only intended to borrow it temporarily to capitalize a business opportunity, and that he had been planning to repay it with interest before I ever noticed. He said this with the conviction of a man who had practiced the speech enough times to half believe it himself. I asked him to show me the loan documentation. Any promissory note, any written acknowledgement of the debt, any communication between himself and Ashley in which the word loan appeared. He said it had been a family arrangement, informal, that families didn't need paperwork between themselves. I told him that was not a loan. I told him that was theft. I told him I would be speaking with an attorney, and I left. I want to tell you that I went home and made a plan immediately, with cold precision, the way it might sound in retrospect. The truth is, I sat in my living room for 3 hours, looking at a photograph of Carol that sits on the end table beside the couch, the one from our trip to Asheville in 2018 where she's laughing at something off camera. I sat there and I thought about the fact that the money we had saved together over 3 decades had been used to buy a red pickup truck and something else I didn't know about yet. The something else became clear 10 days later when my neighbor Gerald called me to mention he'd driven past a new business on 5th Avenue South with a sign that said, Ridgeline Brewing Company, grand opening next Saturday, with my son-in-law's name listed among the founders in the window signage. I drove past it that evening. A converted warehouse space, maybe 4,000 square feet, with the kind of rustic industrial renovation that costs serious money. New tap handles visible through the front glass, exposed brick, a chalkboard menu, a logo on the door with a mountain ridge silhouette that someone had paid a designer to create. The grand opening banner was already hung. He had opened a brewery with my wife's retirement savings and my hip surgery money, and he had put his name above the door. I went home, and I opened a new document on my laptop, and I typed the date at the top. Then I wrote down everything I knew in chronological order. Old professional habit. You begin with facts, only facts, and you build from there. The following Monday, I called Raymond Chu, an attorney who had handled estate matters for me after Carol died. He listened without interrupting, which is a quality I have always appreciated in him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said what I already knew. Civil recovery was possible, but difficult. Criminal prosecution required a level of proof that was going to be hard to establish, given the POA documentation and the family relationship. The brokerage's liability was worth exploring separately. But for what I wanted, which was documentation and options, he recommended I also consult a forensic accountant. Her name was Diane Presley. She worked out of an office in Brentwood, mid-40s, efficient in the way of someone who had spent years watching people try to be clever with numbers and had stopped being surprised by any of it. I laid out everything I had. She opened a spreadsheet and started building a timeline. The $195,000 had been moved in 9 transactions across 11 days. She mapped each one against Connor's known income. His last tax return showed $48,000 in wages from a technology support job. Ashley's teacher salary added another $52,000. Combined household income of $100,000. The brewery renovation, she estimated from photos I had taken through the window and public contractor permit filings, had cost between $140,000 and $180,000. The truck was approximately $68,000 new. Total visible spending in a 60-day window was somewhere between $210,000 and $250,000 against a household with no substantial savings history, no inheritance documentation, no business loan filings on record. Where does $210,000 come from on a $100,000 salary with no assets? She asked. It doesn't, I said. She documented everything in a formal report. $1,800. Worth every dollar. Raymond and Diane together gave me a picture of what I had and what I was missing. I had motive, timeline, opportunity, and a financial profile that made innocent explanation mathematically impossible. What I did not have was something a prosecutor would call proof beyond reasonable doubt. The POA documentation created ambiguity. Ashley could claim she had authorized the transfers. Connor could maintain the loan fiction. Without a confession or a paper trail that explicitly connected the money to criminal intent, the civil route was my most realistic path. But civil court takes time, and I had spent 26 years learning a different kind of patience. I want to tell you about Carol's jewelry before I go further, because it matters to what comes next, and because I owe it to her memory. Carol had a collection of antique jewelry that her grandmother had left her. Pieces that dated back to the 1920s and 1930s. An Art Deco brooch, a set of garnet earrings, a gold filigree bracelet that had belonged to her great-grandmother before that. None of it was enormously valuable in purely monetary terms, maybe $12,000 to $15,000 appraised. But Carol had loved those pieces with the particular love you have for things that carry other people's lives inside them. She kept them in a velvet-lined case on her dresser. When she died, I couldn't move the case. I left it exactly where it sat for 14 months. When I finally went to retrieve it after the account discovery, the case was in Ashley's spare bedroom. I found this when I stopped by unannounced one afternoon under the pretense of picking up some tools I had lent Connor. The case was on the shelf, open and half empty. I stood in that room for a long time. I picked up the garnet earrings, which were still there, and held them in my palm. The brooch was gone. The gold bracelet was gone. 2 other pieces I did not immediately identify were missing. I went to Ashley and asked about the jewelry. She said Connor had borrowed a few pieces to have appraised for insurance purposes. She said this without meeting my eyes. I told her those pieces had belonged to her great-great-grandmother and that I wanted them back by the end of the week. They were never returned. I later confirmed through a Nashville-area antique jewelry dealer, using a photograph I had of the brooch from Carol's estate documentation, that a piece matching its description had been sold to a private buyer through a consignment arrangement approximately 6 weeks earlier. The dealer would not give me the buyer's name. He would, however, confirm the transaction had occurred and that the seller had been a man in his early 30s with dark hair. Connor is 35 with dark hair. I added this to my documentation file and said nothing to Ashley or Connor. I want to be precise about something. What I felt was not rage. I have seen rage in my professional life, and I know what it does to people's judgment. What I felt was something quieter and more durable. I thought about Carol's grandmother wearing that brooch to church in 1931. I thought about the chain of hands it had passed through to reach Carol's dresser. I thought about a man who had never earned anything difficult in his life, selling it to a stranger for walking around money. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I went back to my laptop and I kept building the file. Through Raymond, I learned that Connor had registered Ridgeline Brewing Company as an LLC in Tennessee 3 months before the grand opening. He was listed as sole managing member. Ashley was not on the registration. I noted this. A man who excludes his wife from ownership of a business capitalized with stolen money is a man who is already planning his exits. I also learned, through the public records Raymond pulled, that Connor had been delinquent on state and federal tax obligations for tax years 2021 and 2022. He had made partial payments but never cleared the balances. Total outstanding with accumulated penalties was $11,240. Tennessee participates in a tax lien certificate program, similar to many states, in which the government sells outstanding tax debts to private investors. The investor pays the debt, becomes the creditor, earns interest at a statutory rate, and if the debtor fails to pay within the redemption period, can pursue collection, including liens against business and personal property. Raymond explained this to me with measured language and the slight pause of a man making sure his client understood the implications. I understood them completely. I told him to establish a limited liability company for me, something generic. He suggested Blue Ridge Consulting, LLC. I told him that was fine. I told him to register it with me as sole member, himself as registered agent, and to use his office address for all correspondence. I authorized Blue Ridge Consulting, LLC, to purchase Connor's outstanding tax obligations from the state. Total acquisition cost: $11,24. Connor now owed me money. He simply didn't know it yet. The grand opening of Ridgeline Brewing was on a Saturday in early May. I drove past it twice that day. The parking lot was full. String lights were on inside. I could hear music from the street. There was a line at the door. He had built something with my wife's money, with my retirement, with her grandmother's brooch, and people were standing in line to celebrate it with him. I drove home and I watched the Tennessee Titans highlights, and I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't act recklessly either. 2 weeks later, I accepted Ashley's invitation to a family dinner at their house. I had been declining her calls and texts for a month, and she had escalated to showing up at my door twice, crying in a way that was partly performance and partly real. The two things wound together in her the way they are in people who have done something they can't fully justify to themselves. I went to dinner. I brought a bottle of wine. I sat at my son-in-law's table in the house my money had been partially paying for, and I ate the meal my daughter had cooked, and I asked Connor polite questions about the brewery. He was expansive on the subject. Occupancy had been strong the first 2 weekends. He was developing a flagship IPA and a seasonal wheat beer. He had a local food truck partnership in place for weekends. He was looking at hiring 2 additional staff members. He talked the way men talk when they are slightly drunk on their own success, when the thing they have built is newer than their doubt. I asked about financing. He said it had been a combination of personal savings and a private investor he declined to name. I smiled and poured more wine and let him talk. Do you know what gave him away? Not a drunken comment, not a slip. It was something smaller. When I asked about his supplier contracts and mentioned that I knew a bit about small business accounting from my years in insurance investigation, his posture changed. The expansiveness contracted. His eyes went to Ashley for a half second, and she looked down at her plate. That glance told me everything I had already known. I left early, thanked them for dinner, hugged my daughter at the door. She held on a beat longer than normal, and I let her, and I felt a kind of sorrow that had nothing to do with the money. The IRS, Form 3949. A is a citizen's referral for suspected tax fraud. It is anonymous. It is untraceable. It exists specifically for situations in which a private individual has reason to believe someone has failed to report income accurately. I completed the form on a Sunday afternoon in early June. I was methodical about it. Taxpayer name, business name, address, tax year. Then the factual description. I documented the $195,000 withdrawal from a third-party investment account, the timing of the LLC formation, the physical scope of the renovation relative to the declared income of the principals, the sale of antique jewelry through a consignment dealer. I noted the structured transactions, each one below the reporting threshold. I submitted it electronically, printed the confirmation, filed it. Then I waited. Waiting is the hardest professional discipline. I had spent 26 years in fraud investigation, learning that the impulse to move too quickly is what destroys most legitimate cases. You build the pressure, you let it accumulate, and then you apply it from multiple directions simultaneously when the target is most extended. I had explained this principle to younger colleagues for decades. Now I was applying it to my own son-in-law. The brewery was doing well through June and into July. I drove past it occasionally, and the parking lot was usually active on weekend evenings. Connor had posted photos on social media, which I monitored through a profile my neighbor Gerald's wife had created for me when I explained I needed to observe without being seen. The photos showed a full tap room, events, a logo merchandise line, a canned beer launch party. He was all in. This mattered. The more he invested in the business, the more he had to lose. In mid-July, Ashley called me on a Thursday evening. Her voice had the specific, tight quality of someone managing panic. I let her talk. She said that Connor had received a letter from the IRS. They were requesting documentation for a series of financial transactions from the previous year, specifically large cash movements and the source of capital for a new business venture. She said Connor was furious and convinced someone had reported him. She said he had already called an attorney. I told her IRS inquiries weren't uncommon for new businesses. I told her I hoped it would resolve quickly. I asked if there was anything I could help with. She said no and thanked me and got off the phone fast. I sat in my study and made a note in my file. Phase 1 active. The IRS process moved at its own pace, which is to say slowly, deliberately, and without concern for anyone's timeline but its own. Raymond had contacts who could occasionally provide general status updates through legitimate channels. In early August, he called me with news. The agency had rejected Connor's explanation for the capital source. He had claimed the startup funding came from personal savings accumulated over several years, but when asked to produce documentation, he had provided bank records that showed no corresponding accumulation. The agent had also flagged the structured withdrawal pattern from the brokerage account, which had appeared in supporting documentation. Raymond had submitted separately on my behalf as part of a parallel civil complaint against the brokerage for failing to properly close the POA access. Connor now faced a potential liability of approximately $38,000, back taxes on the unreported income, penalties, and interest. His business attorney had estimated total exposure at $42,000 when professional fees were included. Raymond also learned, through the attorney network, that Connor had applied for a business line of credit to cover the IRS obligation. 2 banks had declined. His personal credit, already stressed by the truck financing, could not support additional borrowing against a business with less than 6 months of operating history. I told Raymond to have Blue Ridge Consulting send the demand letter. The letter was formal and courteous in the way that legal instruments are when they are carrying something devastating inside the language. It informed Connor that his outstanding tax obligations for 2021 and 2022, now held by Blue Ridge Consulting, LLC, were in arrears and demanded full payment of $12,800, the original debt plus accumulated interest and administrative fees, within 30 days. Failure to remit would initiate collection proceedings, including potential liens against personal and business assets. Raymond sent it certified mail, signature required. Connor signed for it on a Tuesday morning. That evening, Ashley called me, and the panic in her voice had progressed to something that sounded like the edge of real fear. She said someone had bought Connor's old tax debt and was demanding money they didn't have. She said it had to be connected to the IRS situation. She said Connor thought someone was targeting them. I told her it sounded stressful. I told her tax debts did sometimes get sold to collection entities. I told her Connor should speak to his attorney. She asked if I knew anything about a company called Blue Ridge Consulting. I said the name didn't mean anything to me. After we hung up, I sat in my study in the dark for a while. I want to be honest with you about what I was feeling. It was not pleasure, exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when a very long equation you have been working resolves correctly. Satisfaction is the closest word, but that doesn't quite cover it either. I was thinking about the velvet-lined case on Carol's dresser. I was thinking about the transaction history on that brokerage account. I was thinking about a line of people standing in a parking lot waiting to celebrate something built with theft. The walls were closing correctly. That was what I felt. I maintained my distance through August. No contact with Ashley or Connor except when Ashley called, which she did several times, with varying degrees of distress. I was consistently sympathetic and consistently unhelpful. The IRS had formally assessed the liability at $39,500, including penalties. Connor had arranged a payment plan at $1,200 per month. His truck payment was $890. His brewery's commercial lease was $4,200. His residential rent was $1,850. His payroll for 2 part-time employees added another $3,000 monthly. His revenue, which Raymond's contact had estimated from the business registration filings and liquor license records, was running approximately $18,000 to $22,000 per month, gross. After cost of goods and operating expenses, his net was likely under $6,000 monthly. He was spending more than he was making. In late August, I stopped by the brewery for the first time. A Wednesday evening, not busy. I sat at the bar and ordered a beer and looked around at the renovation work. Someone had done good work with the space. The brick was genuine. The bar top was solid wood. The tap system was commercial grade. My money had built something real, something I could look at and touch. The bartender was a young woman who told me the IPA was the most popular pour. I finished my beer and left a good tip and drove home. The following Tuesday, Connor appeared at my front door. I had been expecting this. I opened the door before he knocked, which startled him, and I stood in the doorway without inviting him in and waited. He had the documents in his hand, the Blue Ridge Consulting demand letter, and his face was the red of a man who had been building to this moment for days. He said the company was mine. He said he had hired someone to trace the LLC ownership and they had found me. He said this was harassment and that his attorney was preparing a lawsuit. I told him I had purchased a legitimately held tax debt at a public sale, which was a legal transaction available to any private citizen. He said he knew I had reported him to the IRS. I told him I had submitted information about suspicious financial activity, which was every citizen's legal right. He stepped closer. I did not step back. I want you to hear something clearly, I said. I know what you did. I know what you and Ashley did to that account. I know about the jewelry. I know about the brooch that belonged to Carol's grandmother. I know about the consignment sale. I know the exact amount you structured out of that account in 11 days, and I know exactly how you spent it. He opened his mouth, and I kept talking. You built that business with money you stole from a dead woman's retirement savings. You sold her grandmother's jewelry to strangers. And you looked me in the eye at a dinner table and told me about your IPA like I was supposed to be proud of you. His anger had shifted into something else. Not quite shame, more like fear recognizing itself. I can't pay $12,800, he said. His voice was different now. 30 days, I said. Pay in full, or I begin collection proceedings against the business. He started talking about payment plans, about time, about how the business was just getting going, about how Ashley would be destroyed if he lost it. He talked for several minutes, working through variations of the same argument, and I stood in my doorway and I let him finish. 30 days, I said again, and I closed the door. I called Raymond the next morning and told him to prepare for foreclosure. What followed over the next 3 weeks was exactly the kind of frantic, expensive, self-defeating activity I had observed in fraud subjects throughout my career. Connor hired an investigator to document what he believed was a pattern of harassment. At a cost of approximately $2,500, the investigator found nothing actionable because there was nothing actionable to find. He consulted a litigation attorney about a civil suit, which the attorney correctly told him had no merit. He applied for a personal loan at 4 different institutions and was declined by all 4. He attempted to refinance the truck and was told he was upside down by approximately $4,000. Ashley called me on a Saturday morning, and for the first time, she was not performing. She was simply afraid. She said she hadn't known all of it. She said she had known Connor was moving money and that she had told herself it was the loan he described and that she had not asked the questions she should have asked because she had wanted the house and the business and the life, and she had chosen not to know. I let her finish. I told her that choosing not to know was a choice. I told her I understood she hadn't been the one to execute it. I told her I also knew she had not called me, had not warned me, had not come to me at any point in those 11 days and told me what was happening. She cried for a while. "Can you please help us?" she said. I told her I could not help Connor. I told her I could not undo what had been done to Carol's things. I told her I could not replace what had been taken from that account or make the IRS stop asking questions. What I can do, I told her, is offer Connor one way out. One time, tell him to call me. Connor called that evening. I made him an offer. I would purchase Ridgeline Brewing Company for the appraised value of its assets, which I estimated at approximately $85,000 for the equipment and lease rights and existing inventory. I would forgive the Blue Ridge Consulting debt. I would not pursue the civil action I had been building against both him and the brokerage. In exchange, he and Ashley would vacate the business immediately, sign over all ownership documents, and he would provide a written acknowledgement of the original debt, not an admission of criminal theft, simply an acknowledgement that $195,000 had been transferred from my account without authorization and had been used for business capitalization. That last document was important to me. I wanted it in writing. He refused. He said $85,000 was a theft. He said the business was worth $200,000. He said I was trying to steal back what was already mine by stealing something new. I told him the 30-day deadline was in 4 days. I told him if he had a better option, he should pursue it. I told him the offer expired at midnight. He didn't call back. The day before the deadline, I received a text from an unknown number that I recognized as a phone he had borrowed from someone else. It said he needed 60 more days to find a buyer for the business. It said Ashley was falling apart. It said I was going to destroy both of them for the sake of money. I thought about Carol's brooch. I thought about 31 years of deposits, of anniversary dinners eaten at home so we could save an extra $100, of the vacations we didn't take, of the years we drove cars until the wheels nearly fell off, because investing in our future mattered more than keeping up with anything or anyone. I did not respond to the text. The deadline passed at midnight with no payment. I called Raymond at 8 the next morning. The collection proceeding against Ridgeline Brewing Company began that day. Raymond filed the necessary documents with the appropriate Tennessee administrative bodies. Blue Ridge Consulting LLC, as holder of Connor's personal tax lien, which had been personally guaranteed against his business interests at the time of the original debt, had standing to pursue collection against business assets. Connor's attorney filed an objection, which is standard and expected and which costs money to file. The hearing was scheduled for 22 days later. I want to tell you about the morning of that hearing because it is the moment the story turned from something I was doing into something that was simply happening. Consequence following cause the way water runs downhill. I wore a suit. Raymond met me in the courthouse parking lot, and we walked in together. Connor and Ashley were already seated on the other side of the room. Ashley would not look at me. Connor's face had the hollowed-out look of someone who hasn't slept properly in weeks. His attorney argued financial hardship, ongoing business viability, the disproportionate impact of the collection action relative to the original debt amount. He was not a bad attorney. He made the available arguments with competence. Raymond presented the timeline, the documentation, the payment history, the notice record. Everything was in order because everything I had done was legal and documented. The hearing officer approved the collection proceeding. Connor's business assets were subject to immediate lien. If the debt remained unpaid within 15 additional days, forced liquidation could proceed. Connor stood up when the ruling was read, and his attorney put a hand on his arm. I watched my daughter put her face in her hands. 15 days later, with no payment made and no further communication from Connor or his attorney, the liquidation proceeding began. The brewery equipment, lease assignment, inventory, and intellectual property, including the Ridgeline name and logo, which had real value because he had built a recognizable brand, were sold through a court-supervised process. I submitted a bid. The final sale price was $94,000. My bid was $94,000. No other bidders reached that figure. They were getting a business that owed 6 months of deferred lease payments and had an uncertain operating history. I was getting justice and a functional brewery that I had no intention of operating. I leased the space and equipment to a young woman named Carla Deming, who had been working as a head brewer at a larger operation and wanted to go independent. She paid me fair market rate, and we had a handshake on a 5-year term, and she renamed it and rebuilt the concept from the ground up. Last time I drove past it, the parking lot was full. I want to tell you the final accounting because I spent 26 years working with numbers, and I think honesty demands it. The $195,000 was gone. Of that, I recovered $94,000 from the business sale. Less Raymond's fees, less Diane's fees, less the cost of the tax lien acquisition. Net recovery was approximately $79,000. Carol's brooch and the other jewelry pieces were never returned. That loss is not calculable in the way that money is. Connor filed for personal bankruptcy 4 months after the liquidation. Ashley had separated from him before the hearing and filed for divorce in the fall. She called me twice during that period, and I took both calls. I did not make it easy for her, and I did not make it impossible. She is working through what she chose to ignore, and I think that process belongs to her more than it belongs to me. The brokerage settled separately. Raymond built the negligence case around their failure to close the POA access and the structured withdrawal pattern that their compliance systems should have flagged. They paid $110,000 in settlement without admitting liability. That is what that clerical failure cost them. Between the business recovery and the brokerage settlement, I recovered approximately $189,000 of the $195,000. My hip was replaced in January. The surgery went well. I walked without pain for the first time in 2 years. There is a photograph of Carol on my end table, the one from Asheville, where she is laughing at something off camera. I don't know what she was laughing at. I've tried to remember, and I can't. But I know the laugh, and I know the sound of it, and I know that she spent 34 years building something real alongside me, and I know what happened when I let that something fall into the wrong hands. I did what I could with the tools I had. I followed the money. I used the law. I was patient when patience was what was needed, and I was specific when specificity was what the moment required. I did not break anything that wasn't already broken. Some nights I still think about what my daughter chose not to ask. About the 11 days she watched those transfers happen and told herself the story she needed to tell herself. I think about the weight of that choice and what it costs a person to carry it. That part of this I have no resolution for. Some things don't resolve. They just become part of what you know about the world and the people you love. The sun goes down early in November in Tennessee. I was sitting on my back porch when it dropped behind the tree line, and the yard went the specific shade of blue it goes just before dark, and the air smelled like leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the block. I stayed out there until I couldn't see my hands in front of me. Then I went inside and locked the door behind me. It was finished. If this story meant something to you, please hit the like button and subscribe to Frost Vengeance. Drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you're watching from right now. And if you want to hear what happened next, the video on the left is waiting for you.